So thanks to the small group who has joined us so far. We might have others tuning in, and I know that lots of people have been watching these recordings, so we'll make sure we get questions addressed that have been submitted ahead of time. But welcome especially to Denisa and Lori, Numeri, and Patricia, who are joining us live. And we are very grateful to have Karen here today. And Karen, I'll let you say a little bit about your work with Rob and your expertise with systems thinking, but we're very glad to have you.
Super. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. It's been so cool to see your work and just, you know, just how you guys, all the different topics that you're coming from, and just exciting to be building sort of a huge community of practice around the systems work. Yeah, so my name's Karen Grattan. I am an independent consultant. Sort of recently, though, I actually come to systems thinking from way back as an engineer. I studied mechanical engineering years ago, and one of the big classes that you take is modeling and analysis of dynamic systems. And as you might imagine, you know, systems dynamics are really important for engineers. And so that's actually the kinds of models and simulations that has quantitative data behind it. As I went through my career in public health and environmental work and in medicine, you know, obviously these are all strong fields that really think in systems. And over time, I began to start to do more qualitative mapping. So Rob and I actually started to work together long before I think either of us even knew what the Omidyar group was. I was working at the Department of Defense, and Rob was a professor in Wisconsin, and we were working on some projects together. I pulled him on to some of my work at the Defense Department, where we were really trying to understand more about culture and the people in the conflicts that were going on at the time. This was like in 2009, 2010. Anyway, that's where some of our work started. When he met the Omidyars, we actually both consulted together. The Omidyars pulled him on full time, and I've been continuing to work with him and develop this. Did a lot of the writing for the workbook along with other partners and the teams that we worked with. So it's always great to see you guys using this stuff and giving us great feedback. And I'm just, again, joining the community of practice. So hopefully that that tells you a little bit about me. In addition to Omidyar Group, I work with other foundations and government organizations and teams that are using systems thinking to kind of enhance their strategies and enhance their organizational learning and how they are able to interrogate their own assumptions within their organization, develop much more robust linkages between strategy and how they operationalize strategies and the tactics they use, and their learning and adapting. With that, I will stop.
No, that sounds perfect. And I see we've had a few questions already submitted, which is great. This is an active crowd. And I know at this point in the course, you should have finished your deep structure and be moving into the systems map and narrative, which is one of the most challenging parts. So I think, Karen, do you want to just kick us off by saying any kind of guidance that you have for people who are at that point in the process, or if you want to narrate the map at this point, that could be useful too, I think.
Yeah, I was telling, before you guys got on, I was telling Amy how, you know, there's always this sort of tension point where people kind of jump in with this trust, and often we do all the way from explore forces, analyzing cause and effect, you know, doing your upstream, downstream, using the SAT framework, and building loops. Oftentimes we'll do that in a workshop setting. And so, you know, we get through the workshops, we end the workshops often with like a ton of loops. So for example, I was leading a workshop just a couple weeks ago, and we had 36 loops at the end of the day. So all of a sudden you've got all this data, and this can feel really super overwhelming. And you're moving into the first step of like really finding like what's the deep structure. And one of the things, just to go back, and I know Amy said, and I've been looking at the assignments, I know Amy said a lot of people have submitted deep structures. And just to kind of do a little bit of like backward reflection on that, and the thing that's super important to understand about the deep structure is I sort of use the metaphor, it's the coat hanger, it's not the coat. So it's really just that piece to hold the center of the map so that you can build on it. Many people try to get the whole story of the system that they're grappling with in the deep structure, and that's really not necessary. It's really just that, what are those factors showing up again and again that we can turn into a loop so that it can hold the center of our map. Usually the real story of the map might include part of that deep structure, but it'll have 3 or 4 other key dynamics that are driving the behavior of your system. And those start to emerge after you build the map. But of course, it's really important to get started on the build. So usually what I do at this point is after we've done our workshop and built a bunch of loops and we're looking at all our data and kind of scratching our heads and saying, how do we get to the deep structure and begin the build? I actually ask the teams to pause and I say, let me narrate another map for you so that you can get a feel for what this looks like when it all comes together. So I asked Amy, I said, well, have these guys seen a map narrated yet? And she said, you had not. So I thought it actually could be super helpful to see a map and how it's narrated. So if people agree and don't mind bearing with me for a second, I'm just going to share my screen and walk you through a piece of the map. We won't spend the whole time just because I want to get to your other questions, but I think you'll be able to see a lot here. Okay. Can you see this map?
I think it's loading, but yes, now I can see it.
Okay, great. So probably most of you have been playing in Kumu. And so hopefully this doesn't look completely unfamiliar to you, but this is a map of, I'm sorry, Amy, I'm having to, maybe I can, trying to get our pictures small. So what you're seeing here is this is a map that I had the opportunity to work with the United States Agency for International Development at their mission in Indonesia. This is a development objective they had that was around improving essential services to the poor and most vulnerable. And as you can see here in this first pane, where when you click on and there you see their whole map, they're describing here, what this map is about. They talk about right here, what you're seeing is their framing question, and they kind of now are talking about the workshop that they did and sort of what they basically why they engaged this inquiry. So I'm going to just close this pane. And just for, in case people haven't seen, as you guys know, when you click on any of these, you actually get the narrative for each loop. And I would highly recommend, if you're building, that you go ahead and start trying to tell this story from the beginning, from like the story of your team and how you came together, because in so many ways with these qualitative maps, the analytical and the power of the insights rise and falls, honestly, with our ability to tell the story. So it's really good. I've learned to emphasize, and honestly, I can't emphasize enough the importance of, as you're building, that you're practicing the narrative with every build. So when, for example, if you've all have done a deep structure, when you get back together, the first thing you should do at your next working session is give everybody a chance to narrate that deep structure. You'll start to find nuances in the way you story it, and over time, you'll really get the way that fits best for how you need to tell that story. So what I want to show you is, because I think Jeff talked with you about Kumu last week. So I'm not going to go into the details of Kumu, but I am going to narrate a map. So let's see here. So this is their deep structure. So again, their framing question was, what accounts for the level of access that poor and vulnerable of Indonesia have to essential services? And what I'm going to demonstrate here is how the deep structure is just the coat hanger. It's not the coat. And you'll see that they had to pick a story because, you're labeling. And tell me, feel free to let me know if this isn't, probably that's a little better. Can you guys read that pretty well now? Yeah, good. Thank you for nodding. I'm looking at your faces, and that's helpful. You're seeing the pluses and minuses. So they're having to say, well, how does this primarily show up in the system today? And yet it's not the whole story, right? And I always tell people, don't worry, the deep structure is going to be a beginning story, but the other pieces start to feed in and tell the rest of it. So let me just go ahead and narrate. So this is a story of Mission Indonesia and their development objective 2, which is focused on improving the needs, the basic service needs of the poorest and most vulnerable. And typically this is the lowest 2 quintiles in the country. So the way this story starts is that it really starts as a historical story. For many, many decades, the basic needs of poor and vulnerable were not met. There was a lot of wealth, sort of, as in many developing contexts, a lot of wealth focused in a very small group of people, and that people in the periphery were not having services or not being able to participate in the, just the well-being of their country. So here's a story where basic services, basic needs of poor and vulnerable were not being met over time. And over time, this just in general gave a sense that there was just no confidence that government systems not only would provide, but could provide, but ever would provide for them. So it was a story of a growing marginalization and a separation from the center, the sort of center periphery type relations. So as the confidence in that government systems would ever really meet their needs, their level of engagement with the system, government systems, or even other types of service systems just went down. So in other words, people started to not engage with any sort of centralized or government provided systems. They just stayed at the margins, often developing their own systems that worked outside of formal systems. So the more people disengaged, the more the accountability and responsiveness of the government stayed low, because it was sort of like out of sight, out of mind. If you can't count, if we don't know what the demand is, we just are non-responsive, which should then just further undermine that basic needs of poor and vulnerable were ever being met. So this is a vicious reinforcing story. What was happening at this particular moment, though, when we did this map, is that a new government had been elected, and there was really this emphasis and statement that we're going to be a government for all of Indonesia. Now, this is super challenging in Indonesia because it's an archipelago of, like, I think around 17,000 islands, and so it was this sense of, the new president was saying, my government is going to be a government for all of Indonesia. So what I want to show you here is the next part I want to narrate to you is I'm just going to narrate this yellow portion of the map. And actually, just to orient you, the yellow portion of the map is all about sort of kind of governance and how governance is working with regard to essential services. This blue part is sort of the experience of poor and vulnerable. Down here in the lower part is really much more about the role of education and kind of livelihoods. And then the blue captures a little bit of civil society and how civil society plays into this. So I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of this part on governance, which I think can demonstrate to you how, as you start building on the deep structure, it really enriches the story. So let me just zoom in here for a second so we can see this really well. I want to keep the deep structure in view. So the way you'll do this is you're going to narrate the deep structure, and then what happens here is that, so what happens now, and you have a deep structure that is a reinforcing vicious cycle, but now what you have is that with the accountability, with the responsiveness and accountability having been low, the ability to deliver on the capacity to deliver on the safety net has been low, which has undermined the ability to deliver basic needs. That's kind of an obvious one, right? But there's been some work going on. I'm now tracing. I think you can see my cursor too. Here, actually, let me hover here. So here then the story is that with that accountability, responsiveness initially low, the government made this massive commitment to be a government for all of Indonesia, and they made some bold policy moves to make the commitment to ensure the social safety net. And as they did that, they actually did build some capacity, and they actually that helped to strengthen some of the basic needs. Now, initially, this was happening much more at the center. So this was great because, they made this commitment, and that in fact yielded some capacity to deliver and some increased services. Then what they did this is a story of decentralization. So along with that commitment, they also said, hey, Indonesia is so huge. There's no way a central government in Jakarta can know what's needed at the periphery. We want to decentralize. We want to push and empower local authorities. And the more they pushed down to local authorities, that too increased the capacity to deliver the safety net, which then improved basic needs. So what you're seeing here is these are all acting as balancing loops coming in. So you see from basic needs here, you've got the negative story, but out of the negative story, when it gets around to accountability, it starts to go, the government made a commitment. It basically empowered local authorities, and this improved the safety net. So what you should be seeing here is how a negative reinforcing story has some balancing elements coming into it. So now it's telling the more current story, whereas that first loop is like the history of poor and vulnerable being marginalized. Now you're seeing the current evolution. But here's an interesting thing that's undermining the capacity. So yes, the government's made commitment, but what's fascinating is the government was promulgating, they said, we made this commitment, we're going to get a lot done. They started promulgating all kinds of policy. But what was happening is that the policy was coming out, but the resourcing to either enforce or to implement policy was not happening, which therefore undermined. Which then you see here the negative coming into capacity to deliver. So that's thing, even though there's some good things coming into the capacity to deliver, these are things undermining the capacity to deliver. So what I want you to see here is the build that's happening. See how this storyline is building one loop at a time, telling yet another piece of the story. Here's one other piece I'll show you that's really interesting. So not only were they promulgating policy, but the policy they were pushing out, especially down with the decentralization, was so unclear and was kind of rushed that it was causing a paralysis at the local level. Because what was happening is they'd also been, there was a lot of outcry around corruption. So they were trying to do all this enforcement around corruption. So they are pushing policy down to local levels and resourcing, trying to empower local level leaders. But because the policy was so unclear, local level leaders were literally afraid to spend the money, and they were sending it back rather than serving their people and have the risk of being caught on some corruption charge or some malfeasance that they didn't understand. They were literally pushing money back to the government. So that clarity of implementation was undermining the capacity to deliver on the social safety net. So I want to pause here for a second and just invite some questions. But what I really want to show you here is how the coat hanger that is the story, this red story, the deep structure, you start to see the build about like what's working, what's balancing that, right? As you go through, and then some of the things that still, if they don't deal with what's going on around the resource mismatch and the clarity of implementation, they're never going to make the gains that they need to make on this capacity to deliver. So do you see how when it comes together, you start to see some of these insights emerge? So one of the stories of this is like, all the great intentions of the government will never overcome the problem that they're seeing right now relative to the resource mismatch and the clarity of implementation on the governance side. And remember, they're also needing to make good on this because the way poor and vulnerable experience the system now, they're coming in with a sensibility of like, this system doesn't work for me. I belong at the peripheries. This system will never serve me. So it's really important that they get it right so that when people do come into the system, they have a good experience that meets their needs. All right. I've been talking a lot. I want to pause and come back to you guys and see if any of that is resonating or making sense with how you've started to potentially build onto your deep structure.
It looks like we have one question. It says, we notice that the map has positive captions in the bubbles, but the narrative is actually vicious, captured by the minus sign. Is this a best practice?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing to understand is that you can have a loop with all negative signs and still have it be a virtuous loop. Similarly, you can have a loop with all positive signs and still have it be vicious. So it's really, again, about the story it's telling. So for example, you could have a loop where more corruption leads to more corruption leads to more corruption. It's vicious relative to the health of your overall system, but the cycle itself is a set of reinforcing, increasing dynamics. So does that answer the question? Yeah, so I always say name the factors and name the relationships for how they really work, whether it's vicious or virtuous is how you tell the story. And it's also normative, right? It's this thing that we're saying about, I mean, for some people who are benefiting from corruption, they might be like, yay, this is virtuous. This is helping me out. So it's really about the story of the system we're trying to tell. And they're very perspective ridden. I mean, in that, that's why we often say, when you do this work, try to get multiple perspectives. Because when these maps get really interesting is when you start to see these competing priorities and how they come together. So let's see. Amy, I don't know if you can also help me keep up with the questions. That will be great.
Yeah. So she just also added, in some maps, the caption has directionality to tell the story, which sounds like an summary of what you just said.
Totally. So really, as you build, and especially if you're building in Kumu, with every new loop you build, close the whole loop. You'll also probably noticed how a lot of these loops, they always went all the way around, even if they had to go all the way around the deep structure. So you want to close the whole loop and then give it a name, and give it a really juicy name. Give it a name that actually helps you, that captures what it is that dynamic is telling. Because in many cases, you're not going to narrate every factor of the loop. You're going to be showing a map and just saying, so this is a story about how the policy clarity wasn't there, which was really undermining local government's ability to implement this. So in other words, where you might tell it in more of a narrative way, but not actually track through each and every factor. And that, I forget, Amy, is one of the assignments narration on this? I forget.
Yeah, they have 2 weeks, one to build their map and one to kind of build an accompanying narrative.
Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe I'll join in on that one too. I'm not sure if Becky's doing that, but yeah, narrative is like one of my favorite pieces of this, and just over time doing this, really learned about the power of the narrative and the compelling narrative. Like the whole thing rises and falls on that. Your ability to either get partners engaged in seeing through a systems lens, or helping people to see, leverage or where they might engage in new ways, is that ability to tell those stories.
That's very helpful. And just from a process perspective, I think a lot of people end up building like these separate loops first and then are trying to connect them to the deep structure. It looks like in that example you gave, you kind of had related loops clustered together and even kind of layers instead of individual loops. Could you just talk about how you'd recommend teams put it all together?
Really, really great question. And it's really great because I have a colleague, actually a woman who I brought on board onto my team, who I've been teaching, and she's developed a slightly different approach than I have, and probably both of them are worth considering. So what she does is, after she has a deep structure, so first of all, the thing to understand is the loops that you have are really important for capturing the patterns that you've identified, and no loop is perfectly sacred, in that you are going to have to open up those loops and often reframe a lot of the factors to get it to knit together. So what you want to do is review all of your loops and start to say, what is the story this is really telling? What's that discriminating element? What's the there in this, if that makes sense? I don't know. That's kind of, what's the real issue coming through in this loop? And that's what you want to maintain. And it may be that honestly, you have to reframe almost all the factors in order to get it to knit on, right? So this becomes really the art of it. And this is where it's all about meaning. In fact, I wrote that in my notes as I was thinking about talking to you guys, and I wrote here, meaning, meaning, meaning. It's all about the meaning. So don't be afraid to open up these loops and reframe them, and reframe. I mean, that even when you built these loops, you've played a lot with the factor names and how you were going to word the factors. Well, you're probably going to have to reframe those in multiple times, because different things are going to need to come in and out, and you'll have to be willing to be flexible around that. So on the deep structure, what I usually do first is I sort of look and say, I'll often say, oh, these 2 or 3 loops are they're telling different parts of the same story. They're related. They're a cluster. And so what I often do is look at those and say, well, what's the most basic, say there's 2 or 3 loops that I think are similar. I'll look at those together and begin to knit those on to the deep structure. So I might take a first loop and say, well, I'm going to just look at this one and I'm going to look factor by factor and try, where can I begin to connect it to my deep structure, and how would I build that and then make it connect back to the deep structure. And then what I do is I look at those other loops that were similar and I say, well, what's the factor that's different about this one? So I don't know, I'd be curious, when you guys built together in your small groups and you were, telling stories and identifying patterns, you probably noticed that a lot of the loops you developed, there were 2 or 3 factors that kind of kept coming up again and again. And so those are the ones that you'll often make a lot of adjustments to, and then you'll be finding, but what's that one factor that's telling this differently? So what you saw in that layering, Amy, that what you saw was, it was with each layer, it told a different part of the whole story about how accountability and the government's efforts either was or was not yielding improved capacity. So sometimes there was things working towards improving capacity and sometimes things working against it. So what was nice is it builds this whole sensibility, about how that works together. I don't know whether it's kind of hard. This is when it starts to feel abstract, and I'm realizing what might actually be nice is if I was actually building with you a little bit, like if we actually did one. So next time I do an office hours with you next session, Amy, I'll try to build something like that we could build where people could see.
Yeah. That's very helpful. Thank you. So again, if people have other questions, please feel free to either chime in on your microphone. We're happy to hear from you directly, or insert it in the chat box. I was looking back to the discussion forum where people had submitted questions. These are a bit earlier stage in the process, but I think one is fairly foundational, so it might be good to address. And that's just about like how big to be bounding your system. So this person specifically is asking about country versus region. I think they work for a UN agency, and so they're trying to figure out, it's the Asia Pacific office. Should they do a country or should they do a region?
Yeah. Wow. And when I was an engineer and we worked a lot with closed systems, we sort of knew what was in and what was out of our models. What I find with this approach, this more qualitative approach, what we like to do is start with a super compelling question and then build out from that question. I think that, what I always find happens, and I don't know whether this will help that team, but what I would say is I've had teams that say, we want to really get deep on a specific issue. And so they try to get where they might say, we want to look at a really focused, small region, or a sub-national region, and look closely at that. And then what happens is they invite all the right people to their workshop. And what happens is that the people in the workshop, I always say, well, the people in your workshop are going to talk about what they need to talk about, no matter what your framing question is. And what happens is the people end up zooming out or stepping back one level because they feel like they need to contextualize what's going on in that region, right? So I feel like in some ways, you can try to go ahead and cinch down your framing, and oftentimes if there's not enough richness in the dynamics, people will want to contextualize the issue anyway. Because remember, you don't want to get a framing question that drives right to the problem or challenge you think you're trying to solve. What you really want to do is understand the context that issue sits in. So I think if that helps with the level of zoom. The other thing that happens is sometimes people feel like, wow, this is really insightful at the big pictures kind of grand strategy level, but we really need to understand something specific about this region. What they'll do is they'll look at a subset. In fact, I'm doing this with a team now in Nepal, where they're looking at migration of workers to Middle East countries, from Nepal to Middle East countries. And so they really have mapped that whole approach to movement from Nepal. And what they're doing now is saying, what's really going on with political parties and how political parties are either caring for generating policy that's supportive of migrants. And what they're doing is it's almost like they're taking, there's a few, like 3 loops in their big map that speak to this issue. And what we did is we drilled down and we did a more detailed map on those handful of dynamics. So that's another way to do that. And in fact, in this that map I showed you, that Indonesia map, that team ended up doing some what they call drill down into some of those spaces. So like around education and some of the experience of poor and vulnerable. So I think that that's another way to do it when you get super comfortable. Sometimes it really helps to have that bigger picture view so that you have that linking narrative that contextualizes the issue that you're looking at. I don't know it's I'm sure you've heard Rob and Becky both talk about the zooming in, zooming out. And yeah, I think sometimes when you zoom in, people zoom out anyway. And then if you get a zoomed out map, usually it's still really insightful. And to implement programming, you're probably going to need to find where there might be leverage at that high strategy level and then zoom in and get much more detail to develop programming. Hey, Seth. Oh, North Carolina. I'm from North Carolina too.
Oh, cool. What part?
Durham.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
We're up in Tarboro and Edgecombe.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Awesome.
Had 2 questions. We're mapping the impact of adverse childhood experiences and trauma throughout our community, and it is a lot of vicious cycles. Like the schools, the police, our systems are very punitive to people who have experienced trauma, and we want to like draw the virtuous cycles that mostly happen in urban areas to show what an alternate response could be. But we didn't know if that was confusing our map to place like current state and like aspirational state on the same plane.
Really awesome questions. Oh yeah, if you don't mind muting, I think I'm echoing in you. I would definitely, if you're really trying to map your rural, area, I wouldn't put in the urban stuff there. But when you go to the next sections around leverage, you should be able to talk about cases where you'll have some warranted assumptions based on urban cases of what it could look like that might help guide your leverage discussions. The other thing I would just ask is, so usually we encourage people to find out where the virtuous or stabilizing dynamics are in their community. So there's probably, even though it might be a very small flame that needs to be fanned, there's probably some places, maybe even your own organization, where some case examples where things are working, where you were able to either flip something. And what I would say is, if there's a dynamic that's primarily vicious, but it can work because you guys intervene at there's a discriminating pathway that because you guys bring an intervention to actually build that into your map to show that even though it may not be the way the system as a whole works. So even though we mostly say, talk about the system as it primarily works, if you're having to dig for virtuous or stabilizing patterns, and they're not super prevalent, but they're very salient, I would say put those in your map. Try to build at least a couple of those and really highlight so one of the things you have to do is a lot of times it's not just that you've reversed a stagnating loop or a vicious loop. There's some discriminating factor that makes it break the positive for that child, right? So try to suss that out and to find that story and build that in. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. That makes a ton of sense. Thank you. And they're really small, but there's flames in our community that we can highlight, little flickers.
Yeah, the other thing I can do is I actually just hired someone on my team who's in Durham who's got worked at Vance Granville, who's got a maternal and child health degree and does stuff with ACE. And so I can put her in, you guys can maybe collaborate. She's getting pretty good at map building and we're working with a couple public health departments around the country. So
that would be incredible. We would love that.
Yeah, I'll get your, maybe you can or Amy, maybe you can help me find
Yep.
Seth's email, and we can connect you up with someone local.
Great. Seth, did you have a second question too?
My partner and I have done a lot of work in human-centered design, and we've done a lot of interviews with parents in our community. And sometimes when we're building our maps, we don't have clarity for ourselves if we're being too granular to like individual stories versus like, I guess my question is around like the difference between individual story and like, how do I define an element that is representative of the system versus like making it too granular and telling the story of like one person?
That's awesome. Man, these are such awesome questions. I'm glad you're recording this, Amy. Um, yeah, so really personal stories are amazing. And as you know, even from human-centered design, I mean, it makes the whole system come to life, and the reason that you're doing what you're doing come to life. So what I would say is when someone's telling you a story, especially as like you're doing multiple interviews and you're stepping back and saying, so what's really the pattern going on here? So to the extent that, oops, let's see, I might have locked up. Sorry if I lost you for a second. So I think what you want to try to do is step back and say, what's the pattern? What's really going on here? And try to create a little bit of a more generalized loop. And then what you say is, so for example, for Mary Jo, who lives over in such and such, neighborhood, it looks like this. But for, Susie, who lives over here, she has this experience. So literally you can tell both of those stories on top of each other. A great example of this is work that I've done with the Democracy Fund. And I actually you guys should all go to their website. They have all of their systems maps documented in their whole process. And I worked with them for 2 years as they were developing their strategies. Anyway, what's super neat is they actually have loops where they heard from both Republicans and Democrats and were able to say, how can we step back and create a sense of the dynamics and yet say, so from the Republican perspective, it shows up like this. And from the Democrat perspective, it shows up like this. So now, just to tell you the end of that story is that they have a map of how the functioning of Congress, that both Republicans and Democrats literally carry this map around or keep it in their office. And they're like, yes, this is our life in Congress. So both groups can tell that competing story, even though, it reflects their understanding of the system, even though they have their unique experiences might be slightly different. So that's to give you an example of how you want to zoom out a little bit, say, is there a pattern here that I'm seeing? And then I can tell those specific stories as I narrate. Does that help, Seth?
Super helpful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Super, yeah.
And let's see, Patricia and Lori both have great questions here too, so I want to make sure we get to those. Patricia's she finds it difficult to stop adding loops. So we have the deep structure in loops, but the more we discuss, additional loops come in and make us retweak a lot of the map. Is this normal, or is it because we haven't done a good job at the beginning defining loops and the deep structure?
No, it's really normal, and I think that's why and I think it depends on like how many loops you guys built to begin with. But one of the things, like I was saying earlier, what I do is I'll often take 2 or 3 loops together and say, okay, these are really similar. They're telling slightly nuanced parts of the same story. And what I try to do is I say, do they each need to be in there as separate loops, or is there one generalized loop, with maybe a factor that lets me tell it is a lot of zooming in and zooming out, and there's a lot of editing. So usually, just to let you know, it's really common when people first start building maps to where you build, and all of a sudden you're going, oh my gosh, there's like so much. We call that, and I don't know whether maybe you've heard Rob or Becky say this, where you're always balancing the idea of detailed complexity versus dynamic complexity. So sometimes you just get so much detail, but it doesn't really add anything to your insights. It's just, it's like telling the story of Mary Jo or Betty Sue, right? It's a level of detail that's helpful for illustration, but it's not helping you get systemic level insights. So one of the things that happens is a lot of times you will build and you'll start to feel like you're getting way too much in or way too many connections. And you have to start stepping back and editing back. Not every connection is going to help you elucidate really, the patterns in the system. So one of the things that the best thing I can tell you is, yes, you're going to definitely need to edit. You're going to probably want to zoom out and you guys know what I mean by zooming out. You're going to want to step back and say, is there a more generalized way to tell this pattern? And then I can give the detail as part of the way I narrate it. And then secondly, you definitely want to refrain from having built a loop and then saying, oh, but this factor is also connected to that, and just drawing a lot of other lines where you get sort of what I call flower syndrome, where you're just making a lot of petals of a flower because everything's connected to everything. Like, you really want to use your sense of those connections very strategically. I don't know, that's very helpful. I really feel, Amy, I'm really feeling like it would help to actually demo build with people or something, because this talking about.
Yeah, I pulled up Patricia's map. If it's helpful to actually look at that for a minute, I can share it.
Yeah.
Okay. I think she's working on women getting hired into tech positions. So I believe this might be one of her partner's maps, but it should be the same issue. Can you see that screen?
Yeah, this is pretty. You've already got the decorations in there and everything. I'm impressed with your guys' Kumuing already. Let's see. So this isn't, I wouldn't be, how much more do you have to build on this? Yeah, maybe give me the whole zoom out for a second. Okay, so yeah, so for example, oh, sorry, I just closed my chat and I might have, oh, there we go. Okay, so if you could, see, it just went, it's just loading. There we go. So for example, you see how you're showing this back and forth between change through legal policy actions and this back and forth between foundational sorry, and I'm sorry, I'm like leaning so close to the computer. Yes, that's great. Perfect. I can see that. See these, we call this flower syndrome, where you've got foundational self-esteem and change through legal policy actions, and that back and forth, and then this back and forth between women's health. So it's very likely that you need at least one of them, because it seems like, for example, it's Amy, can you hover over institutional bias for me? Just this big label in the middle of the loop to the right.
Yeah.
Just hover your cursor over that. So for example, you might be, I can't quite see it, but you might be telling a story where, when there's foundational self-esteem, people experience feeling equally valued, which let's see, partly I'm not seeing the pluses and minuses, so I apologize if I'm not narrating this. Okay, so that's the institutional bias story. Great. So what I'm seeing in this is that you've got, a loop that goes from economic gap back to self-esteem, and then you've got a loop that goes from economic gap through change through legal policy and back to self-esteem. But then this little tiny extra connection between foundational self-esteem going to change through legal policy, that might be a choice that you would decide, what, that extra arrow is a level of detail complexity that's not, that I don't need. So that's the kind of thing where you'd want to use that sort of, yes, thank you this is a great, you'd want to use that sort of back and forth very judiciously, if that makes sense. So you want to be careful, and sometimes you'll make a choice and just say, hey, that extra detail doesn't really add to my story or to my ability to tell the primary patterns. So similarly, and I'd have to be able to trace all of this really carefully, because it could be that it looks like from women's health to foundational self-esteem, you might actually need both of those arrows, because you've got loops where it's going two directions. Yeah, so if you zoom out a little bit more, and I don't, I don't know whether, and who did you say? I'm sorry, I'm going to forget your first name, whose map this is, but if
Patricia.
you, yeah, Patricia, if you want to maybe, because it looks like you've got one loop that's going maybe through all the way around here from economic gap to economic status and dependency cycles through women's health and foundational self-esteem. So you just want to be, careful, or like maybe this economic bias, this little loop in here, like at some points, maybe you just decide, these extra connections that I'm making, they might be true, but they may not be helpful for the overall framing question and for the driving dynamics that we're trying to talk about. So this is a little bit a case of like the what I call flower syndrome, where it's like it kind of starts to feel like petals of a flower, where everything starts to feel a little bit connected, and that's when, I mean, it's a beautiful map and you've got a lot in here, and you might want to start making some really strategic choices about, is this adding more than it's taking away visually and, just in terms of the complexity of my map. So again, we talk about dynamic complexity. You want to go for you want dynamic complexity. You want those dynamics that reflect the complexity in the major patterns. You don't necessarily want a lot of detail complexity. So details, you want to be careful because they can really take away from your ability to see the driving patterns. I don't know. I hope that doesn't feel too abstract. That's my biggest worry, is that a lot of this can feel abstract. But thank you for sharing your map, and I'm happy to look at it more closely if you do want to add me, and we can talk about it.
Great. Lori has a great kind of bigger picture question, and I believe she's a team leader from Colorado, and she's saying certain steps in this process are so subjective based on judgment calls made by folks in the room and what happens to feel important today. How can you navigate this reality? So it just feels like they're making subjective choices versus objective ones.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there's a couple things I would say relative to a social organizational kind of process and mindset. So what's really great about the subjectivity is, I mean, on the one hand, you invited people into the room because of their perspectives, and you're also revealing their perspectives, right? So you're saying, wow, you see it this way, and now we're seeing that, there's a whole other side of this story where people see it this way. How can we begin to test that? And Seth, this is where, human-centered design can come in, right? Like, could we prototype against this and actually do something in the system to learn more about how this dynamic or pattern actually works? So that's one thing, is that you can actually, using these maps and map building as an intervention in your system is actually really super, super powerful, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is if you're doing this more as an internal analysis tool, where you're going to do investment and put resource against it, you probably do want to go and do some additional research and interviewing, and potentially even desk research to sort of test your assumptions. One of the things, though, I always say to people, what's super powerful about like getting a bunch of experts in the room who continue to tell a story, even when you find that there are data that suggests that, hey, it doesn't work that way. There's 5 studies that suggest that pattern doesn't work that way at all, and yet our colleagues are still telling the story this way. That can become just as interesting to have in your map, right? So now when you narrate that, you say, so, our field, or people in our field, continue to tell this story about, criminalizing parents of ACE kids, and yet the data continue to show that, and here's 5 example studies that demonstrate. And so actually having that as part of your narrative can become super powerful tool to reshape mindsets and people's ways of thinking about things. I hope that helps. So I think it's kind of there's always going to be causal relationships that are that have deeply embedded assumptions. What I love about these mapping processes is their ability to make visible the assumptions that people hold, and the likelihood that a lot of people with those assumptions are actually making inference, in other words, doing things in the world based on those, can be super powerful towards changing policy mindsets and behaviors or beliefs about how a system works. If you want to put something in, you guys are online and want to put something in the chat, if that helped to answer, if you have a follow-on, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think she said, I appreciate the insights around navigating subjectivity. Yeah,
it's a really great question.
I think the phrase that Rob uses a lot is collective sense making, which has been really helpful to me because part of the value of systems mapping is not necessarily the artifacts that you end up with, but just that collective process of making the thinking visible and making some of those narratives come more to the surface. That is really helpful, I think, when thinking about this.
Yeah, and it's sense making. I mean, it's sense making and I just to juxtapose, because I always think about sense making as like from the perspective of the analytical side. So if you're a research team and you're saying, what are these data showing us? How do we make sense of this? And then from the perspective where you might be using, because a lot of people use these maps to do deeply multi-stakeholder processes. And in that respect, it might be less sense making than developing true systemic like intelligence, where now it's not just me seeing the system, it's me seeing you seeing the system, where you can develop a new kind of understanding. Because you guys know the story, and when I use this a lot when I do workshops, the story of the blind monks and the elephant. Do you guys know that story? So there's 5 blind monks and they're each touching an elephant, and the master teacher says, so what is an elephant? And the one monk says, oh, the elephant is like a great hose that sprays water over and cools us down. And another one says, no, the elephant's like a fan, and it fans us. He's at the ear and it fans us and keeps us cool. And another one's like, it's a great wall, strong and and firm, I'm feeling the side, and oh, it's a rope, it's the tail. But the reality is the elephant is all of it, right? It's all of those pieces. And I think the thing that can really help with when you use mapping as a multi-stakeholder process is to help the system see itself and to see the opportunities that it has in an integrated view of itself. So anyway, two different ways of using mapping as intervention in your system, and mapping as analysis.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Very helpful. Great. Well, I know we only have about 5 minutes left, so if anyone else has final questions, please feel free to chime in. Otherwise, Karen, I think, do you have any kind of final words of wisdom for people that are at this stage in the process, kind of deep in the frustration sometimes of building their map or trying to seek clarity? Where do you think they should go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big thing is, is when you start building and very quickly you realize you're going to have to make decisions because the map is getting just ugly and uninviting. Because remember, these maps are objects of participation, and we want to bring people into the conversation with them. And so I think at that point, the best thing is take a step back and start to say, what's the real story here? What are those really deeply nuanced and interesting factors that are actually giving us insight into the system and its patterns? And which things are just details that we can actually capture within through our storytelling. So this is where it's hard in this practice because you haven't gotten as much to the storytelling process. And so I guess maybe my final thing would be, every time you come to a session where you're mapping, always begin by narrating what you did in your last session. So start telling the stories, because that's where you might get the insights of like, oh, we don't need to have this extra loop because I can tell that within this story of this loop. So narrate at the beginning of every session, narrate whatever you built, narrate at the end of every session, narrate. That's where you're going to get your greatest insights. That's where it all comes together. That's how people engage with systems, is through the storytelling. And just to, when people get thrown off by when I say storytelling, just including data is used to strengthen stories. And so it's not just all like mythology, but it's how we actually narrate and bring insight to the system. I hope that's all helpful.
Perfect.
Really
very
excited
helpful.
about your work.
That is super helpful. Really helpful.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. We'll look forward to getting your feedback at the end of the course, and definitely keep us on our toes for what we need to do next to support you guys. We're so inspired to see all the organizations and the work that you're doing. So yeah, really grateful for your time and energy you put into this.
Yeah, so thanks to Seth and Numeri and Lori and Patricia for joining us today. I know this was really helpful, and it's great to see all of your work progressing in the course. I know lots more people will tune in later too, so I hope this will be useful for them. And thanks particularly to Karen for all of your insights. That was really great to have you joining.
Thanks so much. I'll really look forward to tracking along with you guys, and feel free to reach out. Amy, feel free to give them my email address and stuff too. And also I can send you, if you guys email me and want anything or want to add me to your maps, I can, get on a Blue Jeans or Zoom meeting with you and, spend a few minutes. So happy to do it.
Thank you, Karen.
We would love that. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And Seth, I'm going to get you in touch with Bailey, who I think could help you. She knows a lot about ACE.